So this is the first one for actual Rebel Evolutionary. So you're pioneering on this one, Patrick.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't know. I thought you had, I was looking for your other ones.
No, this is an idea that's been coming together for a while. I did a book on leadership, but that was it more aimed at entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial journey and about how it can evolve. And I think personally that, you know, most businesses should evolve to become, you know, employee owned, and that they go through a process of slowly developing the business and then getting to the point where the teams become more like communities. And then why not give that to a community, and then you keep the, you know, the wealth within the community, as opposed to selling it to some bigger corporate, you know, person and growing monoliths. But yeah, the next thing is that I think that we're entering a period where people are looking for answers, but they're stuck in this problem of being in the old system, which doesn't seem to be working out. It seems to have reached a threshold point where it's no longer optimum, even though there's plenty of people that will argue for keeping the system exactly the way it is, and that it will somehow, the tech optimists, tech capitalist optimists are saying that, yeah, we just need to get through this period and everything will be fine, and we could all go to Mars and upload our brains to the computer and that kind of thing. And I think that there's a lot of eco-pessimists who are saying, who are trying to convince them otherwise. No, don't change your behaviors. Well, of course, they're not motivated to. And I think what ordinary people, if there's such a thing as ordinary people, I think everyone's got talent inside them. They just need they need to see pathways. They need to make new connections, and you know, they might be disillusioned with where they are, but they're caught in the trap. They're caught in this without a pathway forward. And I think that's what we need. We need to realize that there are pathways forwards. And the idea behind the Rebel Evolutionary thing is there are people out there that are just getting on with it. They're at that exploring pioneering stage, and that's what we're looking for. And other people who listen to this will be able to maybe take ideas from that, connect it to other ideas, connect it to other people, and we can start, you know, create a larger discussion. That's the idea. So why don't you tell us about your stuff? What is it that you're doing, Patrick? In New Mexico, is it?
So I'm based in New Mexico, but we actually branched out to San Diego, Southern California recently.
Right.
My wife's family is here, and we had a medical emergency, and we have a young son who I decided should know his grandparents while we have the chance.
Right.
And so I have a homestead in New Mexico, which I spent 25 years developing, but now we're developing a new one here in San Diego, which is, we're about 7 years in now.
Right. Wow.
But I was born in Germany. My family emigrated in '68 to Brooklyn, New York.
Right.
And so actually I was on the streets of Brooklyn as a child, and then we moved to London, and I went through schooling from age 12, 76, until university, and then I left and came back to the States on my own. And after university, I went out west and I landed in New Mexico, and I dug in. Now, you had asked me earlier before you started recording, you know, how things got going. I was at university and I probably shouldn't have gone. All my friends in England had a gap year and were, you know, on sheep stations in Australia and picking kiwis in New Zealand and all that. But I went and I got through it. I actually studied computer science and scientific imaging, even though I knew I would never work in that field, but I, you know, wanted to have an intellectual challenge. Once I got to New Mexico, I had applied to 102 jobs at the end of university, and I only heard back from 2 of them. And one was in Australia, and one of them was in Arizona, and the only one I could reach was in Arizona. So I headed there. but I didn't have enough of the mathematics. And on my way back, I was hitchhiking through New Mexico with a bunch of young astronomers, and I happened by a very obscure astronomical observatory, which is almost in the wilderness of southwestern New Mexico in a very high mountain valley, about 7,000 foot above sea level, with mountains going up to about 10,000 foot around. And I guess I was one of the only people who ever went by there, but they offered me a job.
Serendipity there.
Yeah, and so I took it. It took a bit of doing to get back there with my stuff, but I eventually landed and started, but I never really found a place to live. And this observatory is about 50 or 60 miles from the nearest town. I rented a place, but it had to be fixed up. And so I chipped away at it as I was working. And eventually I just decided to live out of my car, which I had been doing, to get there and get around in the mountains and come down to work. And this was in winter, and I didn't have any camping gear or anything. So I was figuring it out with a futon and 5 blankets and a pressure cooker on wood coals. But I was bit by the bug. I had already at university decided that I wanted to design man's interaction with nature. And that's what I was telling all my friends who were going to work at some law firm or bank or whatever. But I had no idea what it meant. I started to get an idea of what it meant in the mountains of New Mexico. And I was very interested in what the native First Peoples had been doing to survive. And I looked into food production, foraging, hunting, fishing, plus building shelter.
Right.
At that time, people around me wanted me to have a respectable profession, and everybody was pushing towards architecture.
Right.
And so while I was doing this astronomical imaging programming and living in the mountains, basically out of my car in the snow, I was also going into the nearest city, which is Albuquerque, and I did a course in Adobe architecture, so building with soil.
Yeah.
I really liked it. It was very interesting. And at the end of it, I asked the architect, engineer, professor who was providing the course to send me on to an apprenticeship.
Right.
And he connected me with an Iranian architect in the deserts of Southern California who was basically developing ceramic architecture, which was earthen buildings that are fired in their entirety. They're actually built as a kiln. They're filled with earthenware, they're fired, and then the shell itself becomes earthenware, and then you vacate it and make it into a house. So I worked for a couple of years for him.
Are they still going? Do they still?
He's passed.
Right.
And his work has changed, and I can talk about that a little bit further on. I ended up going on with architecture for quite a ways, focusing on appropriate building technology,
Did you do
self-built
much with
housing.
earthships? Didn't earthships start out there somewhere?
Yes, earth ships are in northern New Mexico,
Right.
and they're built with used tires that are filled up with soil. And I have a couple of friends who went through their apprenticeships with Mike Reynolds, who developed that.
Right.
And we can talk about that if you like. There's some interesting aspects and there's some less so. But during the time that I apprenticed in Southern California, we actually had an experimental site in the mountains between the coast and the Mojave Desert.
Right.
So it was relatively high elevation, quite isolated, surrounded by mountains, kind of a high desert climate. And I maintained my interest in how do you live off a land like this. So I started developing a garden and a land restoration plan. We actually were on a an old airport facility of about 640 acres, and it had several watersheds intersecting on it. So I did this whole plan from the ridge line of the mountains all the way down to the land of how we can restore it, partly to how it was before Europeans showed up, and partly to producing sufficient food from the land, under the current conditions. But I was banned from doing it by the architect I was apprenticed to. He didn't want any horticulture mixed in with his earth and architecture, so I had to do it all clandestinely. And I managed that for a while. Circumstances changed. This was connected with what was called the Third World Architecture Program at the Southern California Institute of Architecture. So we had a lot of people coming through and other students. I was the only apprentice, but the other people working with him were students who were doing generally their masters, and many of them from developing countries, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. And I ended up with an invitation to go to Sudan from somebody who was running a UN program there. And at the appropriate moment to slip away, I did so. Went through New York City, back to London to my family, and to get ready to go to Sudan. But I was unable to get the UN to bless his invitation and make anything official. So I ended up in London having to sort of conjure my own way to go work with this person in Sudan. And I ended up with an invitation to the Graduate School of Architecture at the Architectural Association, and a consultancy for intermediate technology development group. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but it was an organization that came out of the work of Fritz Schumacher, the appropriate technology guru.
Right.
And they had some projects in Sudan. I was essentially hired to go there and find out what's happened to the last generation of improved earth and building technologies that were being promoted by Western development organizations there. And all of this was around a severe flooding event in which 2 million people were made homeless around Khartoum. Most of the earthen buildings were destroyed. And it was a year after the fundamentalist Islamic military government had staged their coup and come into power. So it was a very potent period in my life and the history of Sudan. What I learned there put me off overseas development outreach type of work forever. And it made me understand that I would have a limited future in architecture based out of the West or the North, working with earthen and natural building materials. But I became very interested in the strategies of the refugees and the squatters when they were driven out of the war zone in the South. Darfur was just beginning then. This was 1989. And many of the nomads and the farmers kind of practiced a spectrum of or portfolio of survival strategies. They planted crops, they had animals, they had family members who would wander hundreds of kilometers out into the desert chasing rains. They could forage wild foods if they needed to. But when they came into the city, when they came into Khartoum, they changed everything. I mean, they didn't get rid of their herds, but they didn't plant any crops. They basically developed a homestead, which was about getting a piece of soil, and trying to get into the urban economy, uh, getting jobs, getting rental income, possibly selling their homestead when they went back to their villages, but they sort of abandoned their horticulture. And I was curious about this. Around the same time, I read an article about, and I think this was produced by a woman called Daniela Soleri, who's the daughter of Paulo Soleri, who built Arco Santi in Arizona. I haven't been able to find the article since. I saw it in Sudan, and they were talking about sort of the homestead as a locus of food production.
Right.
And so I was curious that the people who came in from remote parts of Africa abandoned that kind of subsistence horticulture when they came to the city, but then, you know, high professionals of the West were interested in those ideas, and the two came together.
Yeah, it's a bit like the special forces. So what I found interesting when I was with the military out in Brunei, working with EBANs, they were just, they were teaching us how to forage and how to track and that kind of thing, you know, survival skills. And they would just walk around, they'd have a little bag or whatever, just, you know, and they showed us how to trap and things like that. But to them, it was everywhere. It was like they were walking in a whole place that was just designed to feed them, basically. You know, they could survive perfectly well. They didn't need too much more than a parang, you know, and that was it. Hunter gathering, you know, it seemed very, and they're quite chilled about life. So
well, and the next step on top of that is that, all right, you put one in your mouth, but then you put the next one in the soil, and then you have something next time you come around.
Yeah.
And this is the thing about nomadism, isn't actually wandering aimlessly in new territory. It's circulating among fixed places in which you know you can provide for yourselves during certain seasons and circumstances. Those things were being broken up in Sudan. And of course, we had lost them long ago.
Yeah.
And I became interested in how to reconstitute those. So the idea that came out of it is what I call my work and my practice, and that is ecoasis, this idea of economic oasis ecosystems. Essentially that the resources, the energy, the effort we spend to make shelter for ourselves can also be shared with the other organisms that we need to be in an ecological association with, a symbiosis. So bringing things into our housing systems, which with which we can survive together. And so then I went back to New Mexico. I also learned that, you know, you can't beat the beast out in Sudan. You have to go back into the belly of it. And so I had, you know, said goodbye to the North and the West, but I ended up having to come back and address the problem there. I very much believe that there is a middle ground between how the least developed, enfranchised, privileged people on Earth are living, and how the overdeveloped, overprivileged, you know, overstuffed people are, and that middle ground is sufficient to provide for everyone. So that's what I've been working on. And it's essentially bringing horticulture into architecture, food production systems, energy, water, especially because I chose a very marginal environment in which to develop my prototype. And, you know, all the attendant connective tissue. And I'm still working on it. It's, I'm not there. You know, we don't produce most of our own food. We are not sustainable according to my own criteria. We are quite regenerative, this new catchphrase, because we are constantly planting, growing, fostering the growth. But it is, we have nothing that I learned in school or university or at home prepared me for this in a technical way.
Yeah.
And I keep setting myself goals that are sort of further and further off. So I feel like I never know if I'm getting closer or further from the end goal. Now I'm trying to set us up so we can live off just the rain in a desert. Tricky proposition. But I think it can. I think it can be done. And if you do it on, if you do the numbers on the back of an envelope, it can be done.
Right.
But it is a lifelong journey to get there.
Okay.
And we have to reconstitute the culture and behavior and practices and wisdoms that we threw away.
What's the most powerful thing that you've learned so far, do you think, from this journey?
Start early. Every time you fall down, get up, dust yourself off, and carry on. Nobody will help much. I'm sorry to say, I mean, even among the people closest to me, mostly I've had friction and drag. I've had some support when my modus operandi looks more conventional and professional.
You've got to blend in.
But when they actually come and see things, they get quite disappointed and distraught. And I think, to my mind, once one really understands, there's no going back. It's a slippery slope. And I've come to understand among other people that cognitive dissonance is actually a kind of immunity, a protection against having to go somewhere that your subconscious realizes is a one-way, that street. You'll never come back. And I went there, but I'm still here and I'm still all right. And, people, if they look closely, could understand that, well, it isn't the end of the world. It's the beginning of a new paradigm. And other people are already heading there, and some few have made it. We can all follow. Possibly the driving inspiration is not being interested or satisfied by what's on offer from most of humankind's current endeavors.
Yeah. I've got one friend who calls it the velvet rut that you're in. You're kind of, well, it's quite comfortable here. If you're doing okay in this paradigm, there's not much motivation to change. You're in this velvet rut, even though well, and the cognitive track becomes a rut, doesn't it? It's
well, one thing helped a lot, I should add, and it's tongue in cheek, but it also has a grain of truth, is I took a vow of poverty when I finished university. And I said to myself, I went through university on an annual personal budget of $6,000, which, was living like a king when you had control of it and you chose your own accommodations and diet. And I actually had, money in my pocket at $500 a month. And I said, maybe I could continue at that level for the rest of my life, not try to increase my income and my wealth and all that, but try to stick to it. Now, I'm not at $6,000 a year for my personal expenses anymore, but I am within the ballpark of what I now call a subsistence income. And that was very important because that chopped off financial ambition.
Mm.
You know, because I knew that I would always be searching for how to get by on less, not how to earn more. And that became very important later on when I had empty pockets, or I couldn't put fuel in the car that I was living in, and it was, you know, minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside. I'd have to go sleep in the Navajo Nation police station to not freeze to death. I kept reminding myself, well, this is, you know, the vow of poverty. And by no means am I claiming that I'm poor or we're poor, uh, but it was a sort of ceiling to my interaction with the conventional economy and sort of professional and career paths.
Kind of like a stoic attitude towards things, isn't it? That's you kind of, you're wealthy. The least you need, the least you want for, the wealthier you are. It's just the other side of the coin, isn't it? Paradigm shift. Yeah, interesting.
So then the design with nature was, it gave me actual destinations because, you know, I had studied computer science, but I didn't have a computer and when I came out of university, and there weren't that many around. So I would go to libraries and find books and make copious notes. And I identified the people at the time who were the pioneers.
Wow.
And one by one, I contacted them. And if they were open and willing, which wasn't often the case, actually, I communicated with them and very occasionally went to visit. And I just picked up more and more of a sense of what was possible, what people were working on. John Todd was near where I went to university in Massachusetts, and he developed the New Alchemy Institute. I don't know if you've heard of it, but very, very, very important work around the cycling of water through our households and horticulture, which I'm now revisiting, except in a much drier climate.
Right.
So I got a sense of who was out there, what they were doing, and if work was possible. And I slowly came to understand a definition of designing with nature. Now, I also kind of learned the hard way that there weren't going to be many people hiring me because nobody understood what that meant. Nobody was looking for it. There wasn't any sector of the economy. And, you know, I'd have to basically just sort of self-propel.
Mm. That's quite an entrepreneurial mindset, though, isn't it? That pioneer mindset. People that, you know, not everyone's going to be of the kind of attitude or the. I think that certain people have a higher propensity for taking that kind of risk, and they tend to call them entrepreneurs or pioneers or explorers and that kind of thing. They don't see that as a risk, as risky as maybe other people would be. And I think it's part of that life cycle. We have the universal life cycle that we, you know, explore. You know, it's from spiral dynamics, isn't it? But, you know, you could say we have the explorers that go out and look for new ideas, make new connections across different fields, which sounds a bit like what you're doing. And then pioneering are people that actually go out there and make a start doing it. And that's kind of where the side of we're in this liminal space, I think, between, well, I hope we are, that we're going to change somewhat and change the direction that we're going in. And that it's now the time of explorers, people might say entrepreneurs, but explorers and pioneers, making new connections, challenging the status quo, creating new ideas, and then championing those new ideas. And I think if you were to think about, you know, if someone was saying, right, well, how do I start with this? How do I start producing food in my garden? What kind of very simple steps would you offer them?
Well, the first one is to face your fears.
Right.
This is something I learned very early on, and I don't know why. I don't know where it came from. But rather than running from the things that I was afraid of, I ran towards them. And
There's that risky personality side. Yeah.
yeah, but I'm not the type to jump out of a plane or, to do reckless things for the adrenaline.
Yeah.
It's more that if the hair rises on the back of my neck, I want to know why. And I want to know that next time it won't rise without me being aware of why it's rising. So whenever and this has happened a lot in my life, the hair has risen on the back of my neck. I went towards what I perceived as the source of the danger to see what it was and to see if it really was worthy.
Mm.
It began back when I believed in werewolves as a child, wandering in the dark forest in a blizzard and walking towards where I thought something was watching me or tracking me. When I fell through the ice of a lake, uh, those things I kind of just got myself through. And being somebody who had never camped before, who had always had food and warmth and a supportive environment, actually going out into the wilderness where I didn't know how I was going to get through the day or the night.
But
And
that
I
in itself is, we look at the kind of research on flow states, which is where you're free from your inner critic. You lose all track of time because you're doing something that's just, enjoyable and fulfilling. You're in this optimal state, and it's kind of like a wow factor to the experience. And when you've experienced that, it's a bit, I suppose, a bit like, very introverted people getting on stage and being comedians. And you'd think, well, why are they doing that? When you go to speak to them thinking that they're going to be really talkative and that they're really quiet. I've met sports people like that and what have you. It's when we look at putting ourselves in those situations, as opposed to just buying the dopamine hits and getting them off Instagram and social media, doing things like that are triggering neurotransmitters that actually make life worth living, don't they? It's those, when you've done that, there's a feeling of, wow, that's amazing. That's the thing that's going to attract you, as opposed to, yeah.
And it has, and I'm very lucky. I am blessed that there was no werewolf out there, and that I survived falling through the ice. And all the other ones that have come along. And what it taught me is that our fears are lesser than our capability to overcome them. And so any challenge that comes along, starting a garden, my first garden was a pea shoot on a windowsill in Brooklyn.
Right.
And it didn't last long, it died, but I planted another one and another and another. And my first, let's say, real garden was in the high desert in Southern California, a place that gets 3 inches of rainfall a year and is over 100 degrees, most of the summer Fahrenheit. And your mentor doesn't want you there, so you have to hide it all. Of course, it failed, but I learned something all along the way. So my advice is any piece of soil you can get your hands on, a pot on the windowsill, a line of them on the balcony. Interestingly, I grew cannabis in London on a rooftop opposite the town hall, where it could be seen, but I did it in a way that nobody would ever notice. It looked like a weed. So even those times when I didn't really have any soil, I was constantly trying things out. And actually, when I was at architecture school, I was in London in the early 90s, and I would occasionally come back to the Southwest where I still had my things and everything in my car parked behind a friend's house. And I became aware that the seed banks that had the indigenous crops and the local land races were being gobbled up by larger corporations. And it was sort of a combination of the fertilizer, the pharmaceutical, and the commercial seed companies. They were slowly cornering and kind of taking off the market these independent seed banks. And so I was buying up seed, little packets, just a few quid a piece. And I was planting them at friends' houses, and little bits of land that I found that sort of didn't seem to belong to anybody, nobody was doing anything with. And I called it, it was called guerrilla gardening. And that's really how I got going, because most of those crops I lost, but some I didn't. Some my friends harvested, or I came back to harvest, or they kind of went native and reproduced by themselves, and I came back to subsequent generations of them. So I was building up a seed collection of my own even before I had more than a pot of soil in my hands. Eventually I had to abandon London and architecture. I got into a bind in graduate school and early professional steps, a financial trap. And I just one day pushed eject and ended up living out of my car again in New Mexico. But I had some friends, I had some gardens, and I got into trees then, which are a lot more tricky because you can't save them as seed.
Right.
But also, I remember the lesson from Sudan, which is that, you plant the tree first because it takes the longest to grow. It gives you shade, somewhere to sit under, and it has more resilience in, variable climate conditions. So I started to pursue trees as a sort of foundation to horticulture. And that led me to a new mentor in New Mexico, Michael Melendres, who is an oak specialist, one of the principal members of the International Oak Society, and a nurseryman, an agronomist, and then also a book that had been published, he pointed out to me, in 1929, called Tree Crops, a Permanent Agriculture. And this was a US Department of Agriculture specialist who traveled the world looking at the models of subsistence farms, which were all being in decline and sort of being pushed aside by commercial agriculture, but they still existed, the chestnut-based farming of the Mediterranean, et cetera, et cetera. And his book is organized in chapters by the genus or type groups of trees and tree crops. But the idea being that, trees are sort of the foundation species, perhaps for an ecosystem, and perhaps for horticulture as well. I became very interested in combining natural ecosystems with human horticultural systems so that you have both growing in the same space. And then I acquired my first piece of soil. I bought what from, the coasts and Europe was a very inexpensive house with, let's see, it would be about 8,000 square foot of land, which is what, 800 square meters, more or less. Yeah, fairly small. And of course, by that time I was still weaning myself from architecture, but I converted the existing buildings to, lowest impact. And I started working on the land. Now at that time, I set myself a goal, and the goal was to know when I would become sustainable. And so to know that, I had to have a quantitative target.
Right.
And at that time, nobody had actually set any. And in fact, even today, I think they're kind of largely missing from the debate. It seems to be a qualitative discussion rather than quantitative. So having no numbers to aim at, I arbitrarily chose the 80-20 rule. And I called it the 20% house. I would reduce by 80% the consumption associated with the house and the household from local averages, and I would produce 20% of food and income on site. So that was the sort of objective out of the gate for EcoOasis. Existing building, center of town, marginal climate. New Mexico is, the bottom of most of the leagues in the United States. It's the only state that anyone could compare with a developing country. It's also minority white, which makes it very diverse culturally. And I had figures for what local impacts, consumption, and production were. So I actually set myself targets. So I've kept a very detailed database ever since then, 1997. When I bought the house, I made it a condition of sale that I get the bills for the previous 10 years. So I know what the people who lived there before spent on their food and their energy and their water use and everything. So I actually had a baseline to compare to, not just the local averages, but this specific house. So I did all the energy and water and other conversions, and they're fairly straightforward. And I think most people can handle those quite well. It's not quite plug and play, but there are things out there and one can change.
It's the other side of the equation, isn't it? You're trying to make yourself self-sufficient, but also you're weaning yourself off the systems itself. Yeah, it's a start, isn't it? Yeah.
Right. And then the horticulture has been the biggest challenge. So within several years, I had beaten my objectives of reducing by 80% and producing 20% in all but two categories: water use and food production. And so those I'm still working on.
What's knowing what you know now, what kind of help would you mentioned before before we started recording about the fact that you were looking for what do you call them, case studies. What are the case studies you're looking for and that kind of thing? What help could people give you, do you think?
So the case studies are of intellectual and professional interest to me, but I think they're invaluable to the rest of the world because they show you in very simple numbers what's possible for how much. What I am looking for myself is, and for the continuation of my work is perhaps a little different. I can use the case studies to identify people with whom I might want to collaborate more with, and also to satisfy myself that while others are doing it and reaching their own objectives and sharing their work, I began very early on to produce a kind of snapshot out of this database. And it's a one-sheet summary of the whole, let's say, technical description of my project. So, climate, sort of before, during, and after, and boiling it down to sort of the lessons, the insights and lessons learned. I haven't updated it for a while. I've sort of got several homesteads in play, and there's every month things change, and we have a young one, and many things pulling at my hems here, but I can easily and quickly do that. So I would like to see some case studies like that from all over the world, all circumstances of life, cultures and so on
Yeah.
put out there for people to learn from. What I'm looking for myself and to continue my work is collaboration.
Mm.
I would really like to get together with a group of a dozen or two people who have done similar work, and maybe, if possible, pool resources so that we can speculatively push more projects out there. For example, here in Southern California, it would be ideal to build, everybody's been talking about net zero, and net zero to them means net zero energy, but I use it to mean net zero impacts of any kind. I would like to build a net zero housing project that is essentially off-grid in the middle of, the most on-grid cities of the world. You don't need water from them. You don't need electricity from them. Okay, yes, you do need the internet, and you will have to go in and out of your house to interact and so on. But essentially, you're producing your own food, you're decomposing and recycling your own waste as off-grid and self-contained as possible, but right in the center of the most on-grid places.
Wow.
That's the challenge. And I think
that'd be a good, yeah, but that would be a great way for people to see it. That's the thing. It's a realization of new pathways. It'd be great if they were, as you say, slap bang in the middle. Yeah. It's almost like you need, for things like this to take off, it's almost like you need, say, one of the tech optimists to actually change the mind. For Bill Gates to say, actually, I've got all this land, come and use this. Let's start small and fractally and in line with nature or something. But yeah, if you could get an example of what you're working towards, actually working in the center of the cities, that would be amazing.
Yeah, one of the problems is working through the conventional system, because almost everybody wants a return on their investment, and the people, many of the tech optimists have their money in venture capital, and venture capital wants a return of many multiples within 3 or 4 years. I actually went through a venture accelerator with my rainwater catchment startup.
Right.
And it was great. I was with, it was the Water Energy Nexus. I was with a great cohort of people. The venture accelerator was fantastic because the startup folks, actually selected who ended up receiving startup capital from the program, and the most worthy did. And we very much learned from one another and went to the heart of why our ideas might or might not float the way things are right now. So I'm very clear about why rainwater catchment, especially for homestead horticulture, isn't taking off. But of course, I'm not going to abandon it. I'm also very clear that I could never take venture capital. That's not a path to fund this type of work.
No.
And it continues. But I think it's, a development in a city, you need some real money. And to get real money, you have to deal with people who have real money, and their constraints become onerous.
Well, that's what I was saying about, it's almost like you want someone like that to suddenly see the light. I think that's what eco-pessimists are always hoping for, as opposed to what I think they should be doing is forget, trying to fight the existing reality. Buckminster Fuller, a favorite quote of his is, "Don't fight the existing reality, go out and create a new one that makes the old one obsolete." And that's kind of really what we need pioneers and explorers to do, people who are going to rebel against the system by evolving, using what's new and what we've forgotten about. And I think collaboration and communities where it's at with this sort of thing. If people want to get hold of you, how's the best way to get hold of you? I mean, I'll put links below this on the channel anyway, but what's the best way to get hold of you?
Yeah, so, at the moment I'm going through this transition and I'm sort of staying in the shadows. Uh, I I cannot handle a lot of communications and interactions. Uh, I want a self-selection process. I actually want it to be difficult for people to get to me. Um, and I would be, if I had the wherewithal, I would be welcoming and supportive to everybody. But right now, it's a lean time in terms of resources and energy and so on. I have a lot going on. So I'm kind of gathering
Mm.
myself to come out.
Yeah,
And my venturing into LinkedIn, eventually connecting with you, that's sort of my feelers to come out of the closet. I have a website, I have a telephone, I have some email addresses, but I'm sort of not really putting that out there yet because I don't think I'm ready. And I don't think I still quite understand how to get the lessons I've learned and the message I have out there in a way that will help the most people. So I, respectfully decline to answer that question.
fine. Well, can I put a link to your LinkedIn below then when we do that, and they can
Oh
come and
yeah,
connect with
yeah,
you?
that's my primary channel
Cool.
to the outside world right
Yeah,
now.
get it. Yeah.
Although I have been for about a year contemplating leaving LinkedIn. It's a kind of love-hate relationship.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. All right, that's been great. Thank you very much for spending the time, and thank you for using valuable resources, chatting to me. It's been great. Thank you.
Well, thank you for doing this. And if you have any follow-ups, I'm happy to continue. And I would like to follow where you go with this.
Yeah,
So let's stay in touch.
will do.
All right.